Call a Day with Dr. Amanda. For YouTube, like, share, subscribe. You'll be able to see this in person. And so this week, I'm really excited because we have Pastor Elaine, and she will be talking about the topic of overcoming rejection and abandonment, and what a big topic this is. So I am so excited to have you here, Pastor Elaine. We've met we're doing coaching for entrepreneurs, and that's through 100X Academy. And we had a fellow coach who was doing a challenge for her business, and we met there through, being part of that. And so ever since, I've been reaching out to her, and I'm so excited to hear her story. So thank you for being here.
Thank you for inviting me.
Absolutely. All right, so I'm going to just be asking and picking the wisdom you've gleaned today, and I'm sure the audience is excited as well. So thinking about rejection and abandonment, what are characteristics?
When I was thinking about this question, really looking at the variations of rejection and abandonment and how that comes across in society. And it can be so varied. I mean, so varied based on the age of the person and their circumstances. And so I wrote some of these things down. And it can vary from being ignored. So children, when they're ignored by a parent, and even if like a parent is reading a newspaper and a child comes in and says something and the parent doesn't respond, that being ignored feels like rejection. And so some of it can just be perceived, and then being criticized. And one of the things I noticed was that parents have a tendency to jokingly cut down their children. And so sarcasm is also a form of rejection. And then abandonment can be physical abandonment, like physically abandoning them, but that doesn't necessarily have to be physical. Being bullied so that you're isolated from other people on the playground, or even bullied in the workplace where you're feeling isolated. So again, that can be an abandonment of that culture. And so it can be a peer group, it can be family members, it can be parents, spouses, the general public, and even our culture. And so if we're rejected by our culture, we can be abandoned by the normal streams of our culture. So it can come across in a wide variety of ways.
Wow, and I'm sure a lot of us have experienced that, right? Not having, maybe as a child, right? Hearing something that was negative, whether it be from parents, right? Or outside in schools or other places, bullying or abandonment. These are really big areas, that you're mentioning, and I'm sure audience, you can relate. And so thinking about this, what's one example or one way that you may have experienced rejection and abandonment?
And so I was thinking about this, the history of my life. So I asked Amanda to give me the opportunity to kind of share with you a little bit about my own history. And I was put up for adoption at birth. And so I began with this concept of being rejected, and abandoned. But then I was adopted by these people, and they were very good Christian people that went to church all the time, but that wasn't the experience that I had inside the home. And so I tell this story about a time when I was 8 years old, right about the time I was 8 years old, and I could hear my mom calling me from the living room. And so I was born in the 60s. So this is like early 70s, right? And so I figured I'm in trouble for something. So I went down to the living room, and my mom is in the doorway of the living room, and I could see my dad on the couch behind the newspaper. And she looks down at me and she says, "Your brother says that your dad's been touching you. Is that true?" And I'm like, "Yeah." And she looks at my dad and says, "Is that true?" And he never even looks up from the newspaper. And he says, "I don't know what she's talking about." And she looks at me, and I looks at her, and I'm just like, and my dad would never respond from behind the newspaper. And he said at one point, "I don't recall what she's talking about." And I got really mad. And I'm like, "What do you mean you don't recall? It happens all the time." And I kept thinking, at any time I'm about to get beat, because in that era, you just didn't argue with your parents. And the weird part is that the conversation ended. Mm-hmm. And what happened was, because of his lie taught me to believe lies about myself, which is when I have the courage to stand up for myself and be authentic and real about something that's super important that no one's going to listen, and it's not going to matter. And that really started this long history of my life of just being who anybody else wanted me to be. I mean, I didn't matter, so I'm just going to be who you want me to be. And I wore a mask, but it also started a history of drug abuse and promiscuity, and it went on for a long, long time. And I ended up hospitalized for depression 5 times in 1 year by the time I was 30. And so I tell people, it shouldn't surprise you that I became a marriage and family therapist and an ordained pastor. I just tell people I'm a high-paid codependent. And there's a lot of codependents out there, but I'm paid more than everybody else. I had years of my own personal therapy, years of training, 11 years of college to get where I'm going, and the Bible college as well. And then I practiced professional therapy for 20 years. And I would recognize that people would still get stuck. And I was frustrated because after all these years of my personal experience, personal mental health, and all this training and helping other people, that people would still get stuck like that. And I was sitting on my couch one day in my house and just kind of thinking about that. And I wasn't necessarily praying. I was just like going, okay, why? Why are people getting stuck? And I heard two words. Would you like to know what they are?
I do. I'm really appreciating your story.
Identity abuse.
Wow.
Identity abuse. And I went like, what is that? Like, I would have never put those two words together. I'd heard of sexual abuse and physical abuse, but I'm like, what is identity abuse? And what I realized is that my identity was abused before I was old enough to know I had an identity. So I lived all these years under this premise of what was true about me, not even realizing I was doing it. And so I adopted this identity based on all of this rejection and just lived that out in my life. When I took that concept and that, wow, I've been living a lie. I've been believing a lie and I didn't even know it. And so I went back to my church where I was on staff, and then I went to all my clients and I'm like, oh my gosh, you're not going to believe what God just showed me. And I told them about identity abuse. And I just watched them all be freed, just knowing that they were believing a lie and they didn't have to believe the lie anymore. They didn't have to put energy into the lie anymore or against the lie anymore. They could just be themselves, and watching people get freed. And so then I created a course for that called Identity Abuse Busters.
Wow.
It was just like, I want to really focus on helping people overcome that. And you can find it at identityabuse.com. And what it covers is the three main themes are you're amazingly loved for your uniqueness by God. The enemy is going to lie every moment of every day about who you are. And then the third one is you can choose to believe truth even if it doesn't feel true. And that's the most important part of the healing process of all this, is being able to know that you can choose what you believe about yourself. And the whole rejection thing makes it feel so true. And a lot of people will say, but I've always felt this way. But just because you feel that way doesn't mean that it's true. And so I tell people about 13 years later, the cops did show up at my door, and I was able to speak the truth once again. And my dad did go to jail. I'm living proof that the truth does set you free. And I love being able to help people through that process. So I've personally experienced rejection on a wide variety of topics. So, yeah.
Wow. Well, that's really powerful. And thank you for sharing that, Pastor Lane, and, just hearing that those words, identity abuse, and hearing how when you heard that revelation from God, you got to see, so many people. And again, identity is such a wide range, right? It could be complex, but just knowing that we all can relate, right? That it's just the lie and a truth. And whatever area it is that we have, and it all goes back to if there's been trauma, right, in our lives and or our families history and doing that. But it's pretty amazing hearing you say that a lot of people are like, oh, there's a light bulb, right? Like, oh my goodness. And just incredible, like your bravery, and you being able to put, do this path, and that God's, put you on this path because of what you've gone through and what you've overcome. So thank you. It's really amazing. We were talking, and I know you alluded to some of this, but what were some of the thoughts and hard feelings that you had navigating during that journey of healing?
I think it goes back to like what you were saying, the truth versus the feeling. Really understanding that I was believing a lie, even though it felt really true, and really just saying, okay, is what I'm thinking based on truth or on what I'm feeling? And I went to this, and I don't recommend this. I went to the same therapist for 13 years. Okay, I don't recommend it. And it got to the place where I kept thinking, why am I going to this guy? Because he was one of those guys who'd sit on the couch and go, how do you feel about that? And it would just drive me crazy. And I'm like, he's not even helping me. Why do I keep going, right? But one of the things that he said, a few things that he said that I really remember to this day, one of them was, some of the feelings that you're having are normal for your situation. You have to figure out whether or not they need to be as extreme as they are. And it really made me think, okay, some of my feelings are normal. and some of them aren't. And do I actually think about how I feel?
Yeah.
And that was kind of like the first time I really spent time thinking about how I felt. Yeah.
Well, yeah. And I have another question, just thinking about, that process you had about that, thoughts and feelings. Do you think, depending on how complex the trauma is, that that identity or even that false belief is almost like a safety blanket or something that like you're walking in this identity or belief, because if it was really pulled away, you'd have to really go to that painful place or that painful event. Like, do you think that's part of it for some people?
I think that the journey of healing can be scary. I think that they perceive the journey of healing to be so scary that they avoid it. Absolutely. And there's a certain amount of, really having to look at the situation itself. But the question is, what did I believe about myself based on that situation? So you don't necessarily have to go into all of the really gory parts of it to heal from it, but to just say, what do I believe about myself? And people who go through trauma, so if you're like in the military and you come back stateside and you go through professional trauma treatment, they'll ask you that question: what does this event mean about you? And really thinking about, what am I receiving about that? And I'm hanging on to that. And so if you look at, the whole healing factor of, I can choose what I believe about myself, not I have to go and relive all the drama of my past. And, that's not the baseline of the healing part. Yeah. I don't know if that answered your question or not.
It does. I mean, only because I've heard sometimes people have the belief, and I've heard this from different people, again, everybody's on a different journey, but I've always pressed in, sort of like you have, like in a journey of let's keep healing. And I, heard some people believe, well, if I go there, I'm going to go back. So like, if it's addiction, well, if I go to the pain, I'm going to go backwards, almost like believing like if I go through it, I'm going to be more of a mess rather than the actual freedom you get from doing that. And I just was curious if you've heard that, or if there's ever been someone who's had the fear, it's almost like a fear of going there, but then realizing, ooh, it's really painful, but then there comes freedom. And just curious, and I don't know if that also goes into rejection and abandonment as well. Like, oh my gosh, if I share this, people may not accept me, or they may judge me because of X, Y, Z.
Well, absolutely. I was on a call this morning with some ladies who we were talking about sexuality and stuff, and just how we don't talk about it, and there's no forums and venues to talk about those things. And so really being able to say, how do we open up the conversation when it's like nobody wants to talk about it? And so when it comes to anything that already creates that sense of fear and abandonment in you, then it's going to be hard to just openly have that discussion. Absolutely. The other thing too is that I also had to decide if the church that produced the likes of my parents was someone that I trusted. And so because I was raised in a very conservative church and my parents were part of that church, I had to really look at what do I believe, and what is it that the church has, and I really dug into the beliefs of the church to decide whether or not I was going to stay in church. And when I found, when I had a salvation experience, that church that produced the likes of my parents was something that I could trust.
Okay.
And that when I did become a Christian, that I needed to the church itself and do some investigation. And so it goes back to kind of that choice factor of, am I just doing things because it's supposed to happen, or am I doing things because I'm thinking about choices involved?
Yeah, looking at all of that, and thank you. So again, thinking about that, did you have anyone you trusted? So I know you mentioned a little bit, but was there anyone that you could trust as a little girl during all of this journey?
Not really, because in the era that I grew up in, there was not, the CPS wasn't the thing, 911 wasn't even a thing, it was like, and you didn't talk about sexual abuse, and it was not even, there was no, and so the interesting part though is that years later, my mom said, how come you never said anything? And I said, I did. And you could see her kind of go through her mind, and she remembered the event, and she said, well, why didn't you ever say anything again? And I said, if you didn't believe me the first time, why would you believe me the second time? And so even in that overarching culture of, we don't talk about that, and I did say something. And it was interesting, I did talk to the lady across the street years later, and she said, I always knew something weird was going on inside the house, but I could never put my finger on it. And yeah, so there wasn't really anybody that I could go to. And Christian counseling was extremely hard to find. By the time I became an adult and pursued counseling, Christian counseling was still poo-pooed inside the church. And even, gosh, up to 8 years ago, my pastor at the church that I was working at earlier said, Christian psychology is not your answer. And I'm like on staff there as the staff counselor. And I'm thinking, how can you sit up there and say that? And so it has been really hard for people to get sound Christian help.
Yeah, and I'd agree. And that's an important point. I know talking about this area, because I feel like in the church now there's really a lot of silence on the area of trauma, mental health, and sexual abuse and all of that. And, even for you as a counselor, like, do you see that there's been a change? Like, I'm just curious, do you notice that there's more of an emphasis on that, or do we still have some ways to go with training?
Well, I think that the church needs to understand where its role is. And if they're not trained in that, to know where to send people. And I think the more that pastors are genuinely getting help and they see the need for it, they're more inclined then to support their laity to get it as well. But yeah, that's a very loaded question.
I asked that because I wonder, because even if they're not trained in it, sometimes you may and I used to work as a youth leader, right, in the church area. But what I found was, like, if we don't have any training, right, and this is for anywhere, whether you be in schools, right, for mandated reporter, I know that has been a lot more effective. But if we don't have the training, we may say something to kids, like you said earlier, after your mom didn't believe you the first time, and then years later she's like, well, why didn't you tell me? And you're like, well, you didn't believe me the first time, right? And so depending how we respond, to kids, or when people are disclosing sexual abuse, does matter. And so, I just wonder that, because, as we see, like, that mental health and the trauma, and, not even just in the church, like, I just see that need everywhere, but especially, like, in a place, like, if you're in church where it's that, you need that safety. And so that was where that came from. I was just curious.
And it's true. I think that if as a leader of any kind in the community, to have the resources to know if somebody should come to me with this kind of information, what do I do with it? And to be able to say, I'll be happy to listen, and then refer them to the appropriate authorities or whatever, I think that one of the biggest challenges is, I used to do ethics teaching for churches. So and just talk about all of this and say, you need to know when you don't know, and be okay that you don't know, but know who to refer them to. And normalize it. And that was one of the things about my book that I wrote, that it's like a do-it-yourself kind of like journal type of thing. Mm-hmm. And I've had pastors that have taken it and read it, and they've preached from it, and they've gotten the benefit of it, because I crammed like 17 years of therapy into this, very succinct little parts and pieces, where, to me, rather than trying to go to a therapist and wait for the topic to come up, you can actually go and have all this content. And it's been surprising to me, because I gave it out at a conference in San Diego to all these pastors, and the Spanish community just loved it. So I had it translated into Spanish, and I give it away free to Spanish pastors, because just to have the resource. What do I do if somebody has this and it's super practical? So I'm totally about resourcing people. Absolutely.
Yeah, that's excellent. I know you'll be talking about that shortly as well. We're really coming to the end of our time, but I wanted to just have you think about, if there's anything else from your story about rejection or abandonment, anything in your overcoming that may have not been there. I know you have an amazing book that, again, for the audience, we only have you for a short amount of time. However, for the audience to be able to take away some of these wisdom tips that, you have learned in this, 17 years, and even, through counseling and being a counselor and walking with different people. And there's some really big ones, like the identity abuse. But again, if there's any other things for people who are struggling right now with a rejection and abandonment in many areas, like, what would you want to tell them?
Oh, well, I wanted to tell the story about the day that God made you. Do I have time for that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so this is a story, and it's on YouTube, so you can look it up later. So I'm going to tell you the story. I'm going to tell Amanda the story of the day that God made Amanda. Okay, so there was a day that the God that made the mountains and the oceans and everything beautiful stopped everything he was doing, and he said, I'm going to make an Amanda. And he took the cells of your body and he swirled them in his hand, and he thought about the color of your eyes and the color of your hair and the shape of your toes. And he was so excited. He goes, Angels, check it out. I'm making an Amanda. And they're like, oh God, you've never made anything like that before. And he says, no, Amanda's different. Amanda's different than anything I've ever made before. And the way she sees the world and responds to the world is going to be different than anything I've ever made before. And he thought about your favorite food and your favorite color and your favorite animal. And he says, this is good. He says, Amanda, I love you. I love you so much. Everything about you matters to me. Everything. The things that bring you happiness and joy, but also the things that bring you sorrow and pain. It all matters to me. And Amanda, it's my hope for you, as it is for everyone, that when I put you in the world, that you have two parents that tell you every day how much you matter to me every day. Now, some parents, they do their job really well, and other parents not so much. And some parents aren't around, and then sometimes bad people do bad things to good kids. And Amanda, the world's going to come along and say, you don't look right. You don't sound right. You don't live here. You don't know these things. You don't have this stuff. And every day, thousands of messages will bombard you and make you feel like you're not good enough for me. And it might get really hard for you to hear my voice and to remember how much you matter to me. But Amanda, I want you to know that every moment of every day, I'm right by your side. No matter where you go and no matter what you do, I will never abandon you. And Amanda, I also want you to know that I'll never be disappointed in you. Now, I might be disappointed in some things that you say or some things that you do or even some things that you think about. But I'll never be disappointed in who you are, because you, Amanda, are exactly the way I created you to be. And I am your biggest cheerleader. And I'm looking forward to seeing you again someday and welcoming you home and giving you a great big hug. And I hope you remember that every day for the rest of your life. My final point is you get to choose what you believe about yourself. It's a choice.
That's incredible. I love that. Just hearing that, right? And just, it's impactful for me and hopefully for the audience out there. Maybe you're not Amanda, maybe you are. So you got the, the little wisdom, you got the dose of it from Pastor Elaine. But if you're not, hopefully you put your name in there, right? And if you're watching on YouTube, you can stop and pause that when Pastor Elaine speaks that, or check out her YouTube video. But if you need to, stop on YouTube and pause and listen. If you're on the podcast, you could always replay it. But that's some really powerful messages, right? That no matter what, you are loved. No matter what, you're never a disappointment. And so thank you. That's incredible. I love those. That's a huge wisdom tip. So, Pastor Elaine, and you had mentioned your curriculum, which I'm really excited about, intrigued, and where you can find it, and your book. So I'm just going to give you some time to explain some of that for our audience. And I will post this for everybody listening on the podcast. This will be posted in the description of the podcast. And for YouTube, I will have this in the description as well, so you can get these resources.
And so I try to make it as easily accessible as possible. So it's identityabuse.com. And Identity Abuse Busters is the content that I use for my coaching, my personal one-on-one coaching program. And it's available on an e-course, so you can do it by yourself in the privacy of your own home. And as soon as you go to identityabuse.com, it's going to be the first thing that you see. And the book is also available on the same website.
Incredible. And then do you have, I know you were talking about your book, do you have a copy that you can show them?
Yes, it is. It's called Jesus is In. So it's like Jesus had his own little therapy office, and then it's, I think, 100 and some odd different quotes that I make, and it's done in journal format, so you have to fill it out, and it's all applicable to your life today. So each segment has a question for today. It covers everything from your relationship with God, your relationship to yourself, mentally managing yourself, social situations, and parenting. So it covers a lot.
Yeah, it's really cool.
17 years of therapy in one book.
Wow, it's really comprehensive. So in a small dose of wisdom here, so hopefully you can check out identityabuse.com. Is that correct? Pretty simple. Yes. And also her book that has all kinds of topics that will help you. And so thank you, Pastor Elaine. This was incredible today. I'm so excited. And again, we got our daily dose, if not many doses of wisdom. If you really enjoyed this, like, share, and subscribe. And we will see you back again tomorrow for some more wisdom.